Good morning, Spartan Nation. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you all on this Friday, but instead we will have the return of the lecture video to get started with our unit on elections, Chapter 11 in your textbook. Now, to go over the order of operations for today, you should have already taken the reading quiz on last night's reading up on Edline under Chapter 11 Reading Quizzes. And now you should be watching this lecture video immediately after taking that reading quiz. Once you have finished watching this lecture video, there will be a Google Doc activity, a Google form for you to fill out of your responses to the 5 proposals laid out in this video up on Edline, and that will be your substitute activity grade for today. Don't forget your homework over this weekend, which is to be reading Politicians Don't Pander so that we can discuss it in class when I see you all on Monday. Now, by this time, starting a new chapter is Old Hat for you guys. See what I did there, playing new off of old? God, I am good at this. New chapter is Old Hat for you all. You know how we start each and every chapter. We take a look at what it is the Constitution has to say about that particular institution of the U.S. government. Which poses a problem with elections, because the Constitution has precious little to say about the role of the U.S. federal government in elections, because elections are a reserved state power. This is something that we will detail in 4-part harmony later on, but instead, since we don't have a lot of constitutional authority to look at for elections, the Constitution just says that there will be some. Instead, what I want to do with our first class and with this lecture video is I want to get you all to think a little more deeply about the setup that the book gave you. So, without further ado, let's please consider the following. Your textbook went very, very basic here, asking us to consider the who, how, where, and what of American elections. Who participates in elections? It was the first question that they posed to us, and as you found out, it's mostly old people. Next question that we had to deal with was, how is it that Americans vote? Not for whom, but literally the topic of how is it that Americans vote, the mechanical process by which we go about casting a ballot. Third question, where elections are held, although maybe more accurately, given the amount of time that they talked about single-member districts and proportional representation, the question is, over what jurisdiction are elections held? Nah, it's still a sloppy question. You know what? That one's just going to be easier when we have some maps to show for it. Fourth question, what is it that determines the winner of an election? As Chicago shows us, it might be a little bit more complicated than we think. And just because I love y'all, a special bonus, the question of when should elections be held? Here's what's going to happen in the upcoming lecture video. I am going to detail a proposal to change each of these 5 things in some substantive way. You will then go to a Google Doc and let me know what you think of the proposals I'm making for you. Some of them are proposals that I personally endorse. Some of them are proposals that I think are downright terrible. We'll discuss them alongside Politicians Don't Pander on Monday in class. So, the first question that we have to consider, who is it that votes in American elections? As you found out from the reading, not everybody. In fact, not even a lot of people. 56.5% of eligible voters participated in the 2012 presidential election. That rate puts us pretty low compared to Western democracies, as you had diagrammed for you in the book. I mean, yeah, sure, we're beating France, but when has that not been the case? Now, we can debate, and maybe we even will debate, whether or not it is a problem that we have such low voter turnout. Keep in mind, throughout the section on public opinion, one of the things that we said is that our public is notoriously ill-informed, so maybe we only want a certain percentage of the public turning out for elections. But if we assume that this is a problem, a question becomes, what could we do to improve voter turnout in the United States? And one thing that we could do is we could make ourselves a little bit more like the Australians. The textbook already highlights one way in which we're like Australians with our ballot, where it introduced that vocabulary term of the Australian ballot for you, the ballot that is not party-based but instead lists all offices up for election. Well, another thing that Australians have had throughout their voting history is a tradition of what's called compulsory voting, requiring the population to vote. It is not only your civic right to participate in an election in Australia, it is your civic duty. In Australia, all citizens over the age of 18 must register to vote, and then they must participate in all national elections. If they are registered to vote and do not participate in an election, they are sent a bill for a $20 fine. While $20 does not seem like a lot, it does seem like it is a motivator to get Australians out to the polls, as approximately 93 to 95% of registered voters in Australia do turn out to vote, possibly because they are looking to avoid that fine. Now, your textbook labels the Australian voting percentage at only 81% rather than 93 to 95, which I just quoted you. That's because your textbook does an awful thing with numbers there, and it starts to look at people who are overall eligible to vote versus registered to vote, and it miscompares them across different nations. So that chart should be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. Anyway, in Australia, you are required to vote once you turn 18. If you do not vote, you are eligible to pay a $20 fine. If you fail to pay that $20 fine, you are eligible for up to a $170 fine. A couple of technicalities to deal with that are related to the issue of compulsory voting as practiced in Australia. Probably the two frequently most asked questions I get is, what do people actually pay that fine? 1/3 of the people who do not vote actually end up paying that fine, or likely end up paying that fine, with the other 2/3 having some sort of valid excuse as to why they did not vote. Another common case that is made against compulsory voting is that, well, it's like my civic right, man, to say I don't want to vote for any of these clowns, because forget the system. And you still have the right to do that in Australia. It does not say that you need to vote, it merely says that you need to mark on your ballot. How you mark it is entirely up to you, and a number of Australians get quite creative with that. While the system is Australian by birth, it is used in a number of other places, and if you look at that list there, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Uruguay, it is predominantly currently used in South American nations. There are a number of European nations that have a compulsory voting law on the books, but it's really Australia and the South Americans who do anything to enforce some sort of a compulsory voting law. As you can probably guess, here is the proposal that I'm going to ask you to consider for changing who it is that votes in American elections. Proposal: all Americans age 18 and older should be required to vote in congressional and presidential elections or pay a fine. I'll ask you to consider that one, and that'll be one of the ones that you will give me feedback on in the Google form. Question 2. How is it that Americans vote? And as I said in the introduction, this isn't a question of, well, who do we vote for, or what types of preferences do we have? This is the mechanical question of how it is that Americans vote. This is what an American ballot looks like, or this is at least one of the forms that an American ballot can take. It is decidedly stripped down of any sort of ornamentation. It is very Australian in its nature. It lists each office individually, gives you all of the people who have qualified for the ballot for that office. It gives you their names, and it asks you to punch a hole out right to the right side of your candidate's name. We've got fancy ones here in Gaston County. You get to do a Scantron form, so that's really what we've been training you for all this time. Although I will point out that they have the good Scantron forms that you can use pen on, so the future is pretty much here. This is probably similar to every ballot that you have ever cast, ever looked at, so what would a different ballot look like? Well, let's take a look at a ballot from Colombia. Here is a Colombian ballot from 2010. You should notice the difference. First of all, men in hats. Secondly, there is a good number of, a lot more parties represented than we see on an American ballot, but we also notice the difference in color, the difference in presentation of the candidates, the difference in that each political party has their logo shown right there. There's a couple of important factors about this. One, it's more aesthetically appealing, and it allows candidates to have some sense of aesthetic appeal that goes with the voting process, the ability to set a face to the name. It also makes the party appear more prominent. You are more likely to notice which party it is that you are voting for on a ballot such as this than you would be on an American ballot. But another very practical implication of this ballot is it is stupid easy to use. You just draw on the face of the person that you want to vote for. I know it sounds strange to say that the American ballot can be confusing, but in recent memory, there has been an American ballot that could have very well had an impact on a presidential election. This here is the ballot that was used in Florida in the 2000 presidential election, which notoriously confused the octogenarians voting in Florida, many of whom could not figure out how that thing worked. Probably because it works a lot like the Facebook timeline. So, here is the proposal that I have for you all. American ballots should have a more appealing design that puts a focus on party logos and politicians. And I would add, kind of as a tertiary detail, makes the process just a little bit more idiot-proof. If we're asking the question of where it is elections are held, our mechanical answer is where it is elections are held. Where it is elections are held, our mechanical answer is going to be quite boring. I vote in an elementary school gymnasium. So it's not the same thing as how votes are cast, where the mechanical element is actually slightly interesting. The where of elections that we're going to ask about is where will electoral borders be drawn? A picture's worth 1,000 words. This one's worth 435 words. What you see up here is the map of congressional districts, something that should be familiar to us from our unit on Congress. The way that it works is that each of those congressional districts holds an election every 2 years, and whoever wins the election within that district is that district's representative to the U.S. Congress for the next 2 years. Those borders define who it is that gets elected. Those borders define who it is that represents the people who live within those jurisdictions. Those borders are quite significant to deciding whether or not you as a voter are going to feel represented. After all, somebody who is living in, let's just throw out the stereotype here and say the Deep South, but is a liberal Democrat, might feel as though their vote is not represented in congressional elections if their state or if their district always elects a staunch conservative. Similarly, somebody who is living in eeny, meeny, miny, California in San Francisco and is a staunch conservative, they're not going to feel like they are entirely represented by their congressional representative. And the same can be said not just about Congress, but about presidential elections as well. Presidential elections, where we draw the borders for the Electoral College, it happens to be that we draw the borders on the existing state borders, but those borders are highly influential in determining the outcome of a given presidential election. Here we see the 2012 presidential election, where even though Governor Romney won North Carolina by a very narrow margin, and President Obama won Virginia by a similarly narrow margin, we see that Governor Romney got all 15 electoral votes from North Carolina, President Obama all 13 electoral votes from the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's a system that is often under attack. It is a system that can and will be debated coming up in this class. Oh yes, baby, what? The Gulf Olympics are back! Woohoo! Happy day! But What I want us to do is briefly consider an alternative to this type of a system, a single result district where the districts are all winner take all. Let's please consider our grandpappies. Let's please consider the British. If you look at the way that the British system works, there are borders drawn to be sure, but the way that it works is you count up all of the votes that are cast within that border, and then you divide up the number of seats that that district or that area, that geographical block has, based on how the proportion of the votes were cast. It's a system that allows for a representation that is more indicative of the political leanings of the people within a given jurisdiction. After all, instead of being forced to have, in the state of Virginia, either all go Republican or all go Democrat in the Electoral College, North Carolina and Virginia are both very closely contested political states right now. If we wanted to have perfect representation for them, maybe one of each, maybe 6 and 4 as a split, this allows for that type of splitting in a way that the American electoral system currently does not. So, proposal number 3 on the floor for y'all. Be it resolved that the United States should abolish congressional districts in favor of creating a system where seats are awarded based on the proportion of the vote a party won in that state. I've got a couple of leading questions for you all in the Google Doc. I am interested to hear your response. This is obviously one that we will be hearing about again. Question 4. What does it take to win an election? Well, we usually think you have to be the person with the most votes. But the greatest city on earth, the city of Chicago, God, don't you just feel the passion burn in your soul when you see that flag? Well, the city of Chicago is currently undergoing a bit of a dilemma over the question of what does it take to win an election? Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and former chief of staff to President Obama, is up for re-election, or I should rather say was up for re-election in the city of Chicago for the position of mayor, and he won 45% of the vote. The careful observer will note that 45% is not a majority of the vote. It is a plurality of the vote, as his nearest competitor, Jesus Garcia, seen at right there with what I hope is his family, got 34% of the vote, and other candidates split the remaining portion of the vote. What now stands is that Chicago will go into a runoff election, where it will be a direct mano-a-mano election between current mayor Rahm Emanuel and challenger Garcia. So, this is a very interesting system. It is a system that sets it up in such a way that in order to represent a given locale, you must have a majority of the people who live there, or at least a majority of the people who live there and voted for you, vote for you. So, should we consider implementing this on a larger scale? Many states already do require that you win a plurality of the vote, a majority rather than a plurality of the votes in order to be elected to Congress, but some states do not, and it's currently a state prerogative. So, our resolution today, be it resolved that all congressional elections should require that the candidate win a majority of votes rather than the simple plurality. You may notice that I am saying congressional elections. Why no love for presidential elections? Well, because we actually already have a system that's similar to this for presidential elections. If a candidate fails to win a majority of votes in the Electoral College, the electoral vote, or the determination of who it is that will be the next president of the United States, will be made by the U.S. House of Representatives, a certain corrupt bargain that you may remember from your U.S. history class. Finally, the bonus question. When is it that Americans vote? This is one that is a question that is not raised by your textbook, but I feel like there is a case to be made that the question of when is it that Americans vote is directly tied to our first question, who is it that votes in elections? When are elections held in America? Well, elections are held on the first Tuesday to follow a Monday inside of the month of November. That's not always a convenient date for a lot of people. The first Tuesday following a Monday in the month of November is always a work day. So, my question is, why is it that we don't have a holiday for elections? Why is it that we don't have a national day where citizens are allowed to go to the polls without worrying about going to work? You know, we could even make a celebration about it. This fifth proposal and fifth and final proposal is to have a celebration of America where we can all take a day off and participate in our democratic heritage, a day where we can all go off and participate in the institution of elections. Proposal number 5 is that as a way of increasing voter turnout, we should institute America Day, a national holiday exclusively dedicated to the day on which Americans vote, go out and get some hot dogs and apple pie and watch Mark McGuire hit some dingers. Anyways, these are 5 different proposals for ways in which we might change American elections. What your task is to consider each of the 5, head off to the Google form that I have linked to on Edline, give some feedback. We will discuss each of these 5 proposals alongside Politicians Don't Pander when I see y'all on Monday.